For generations, farmers in Oakhaven Valley cursed two relentless enemies, the jagged limestone rocks shattering their plows and the brutal autumn winds that stripped their topsoil bare. Millions of tons of stone were hauled to the ravines, treated like an incurable disease. But when foreclosure stared 58-year-old Arthur Pendleton in the face, he stopped hauling and started stacking. While his wealthy neighbors laughed, mocking him as a desperate man who had finally lost his mind, Arthur kept building. He didn't know it yet, but those hated, rejected stones were about to construct an impenetrable fortress, halt a natural disaster, and double his harvest. Oakhaven Valley, situated on the unforgiving edge of the Great Western Plains, was a place of breathtaking sunsets and back-breaking realities. The soil here was a paradox, rich in organic matter, deeply fertile, yet cursed by two relentless enemies, the rocks and the wind. River Pendleton, a 58-year-old third-generation farmer, knew both enemies intimately. His hands, calloused and mapped with scars, told the story of 40 years spent fighting the earth. Pendleton Acres was a modest 400-acre spread located right in the throat of what the locals called the Devil's Corridor. It was a geographical funnel where the western prevailing winds gathered speed, howling through the valley every late spring and early autumn. But the wind wasn't the only curse. The land was practically paved with subterranean limestone. Every winter, freeze and spring thaw pushed a new crop of jagged, pale stones to the surface. Farming in Oakhaven meant spending weeks every spring engaging in the soul-crushing labor of rock-picking. "Another broken shear pin," River muttered, wiping a mixture of grease and topsoil from his forehead. It was a brisk Tuesday in early April. He was kneeling beside his John Deere chisel plow, staring in frustration at the heavy steel shank that had just snapped against a submerged boulder the size of an engine block. His neighbor, Richard Abernathy, owner of the 5,000-acre Abernathy AgriCorp, happened to be driving past in his pristine, climate-controlled Platinum Edition pickup. Abernathy slowed down, rolling his window down just enough to let his voice out without letting the dust in. "Fighting the ghosts of the valley again, River?" Abernathy called out, a patronizing smirk plastered across his face. Abernathy had long abandoned traditional farming, relying on heavy chemical interventions and aggressive, deep-ripping machinery to force the land into submission. He'd been trying to buy Pendleton Acres for a decade, always at a fraction of its worth, hoping to square off his massive corporate holdings. "Just doing the work, Richard," River replied tightly, not looking up as he wrenched the broken pin free. "You know my offer still stands," Abernathy said smoothly. "3,000 an acre. It's generous considering half your topsoil blows away every October, and the other half is solid rock. You're killing yourself for a piece of dirt that doesn't want you here. The land is fine. Drive safely, Richard." Abernathy chuckled, rolled up his window and sped off, leaving a plume of suffocating dust in his wake. River coughed, looking out over his field. Abernathy was arrogant, but he wasn't entirely wrong. The financial reality of Pendleton Acres was grim. The previous 3 harvests had been devastated by the howler, the local name for the brutal autumn wind shear that flattened mature wheat and stripped away the precious, moisture-retaining topsoil. That afternoon, sitting at the scarred oak dining table, River's wife Claire slid a stark white envelope toward him. The return address read, "Midwest Agrarian Credit Union." "It's Henry Higgins," Claire said softly, her voice betraying a tremor of anxiety she usually managed to hide. "He called twice while you were in the North 40. The extension on the equipment loan, it's been denied, River. They want the arrears by November 1st, or they're initiating foreclosure." River closed his eyes. November 1st. That meant everything hinged on this single harvest. If the howler struck again with the same ferocity as last year, they wouldn't just lose the crop, they would lose the legacy his grandfather had bled for. He walked out to the back porch, staring at the massive ravine at the edge of his property. For 80 years, the Pendletons, like every other farmer in the valley, had dragged the accursed limestone rocks out of the dirt and dumped them into that ravine. It was a massive, jagged graveyard of wasted effort, millions of pounds of stone As the evening temperature dropped, River walked down to the edge of the ravine. He rested his hand on a large, flat slab of limestone sitting on top of the pile. He pulled his hand back in surprise. The air was chilling rapidly, but the stone was remarkably warm. It had been absorbing the harsh prairie sun all day, and now it was slowly radiating that heat back into the cool evening air. He looked at the vast, empty expanse of his western field line, totally exposed to the impending wrath of the Devil's Corridor. Then he looked back at the millions of rocks sitting uselessly in the ditch. An idea, born of absolute desperation and bordering on madness, took root in River's mind. If he couldn't beat the rocks, and he couldn't beat the wind, maybe he could make them fight each other. The next morning, instead of hooking up the seed drill, River attached the heavy-duty front-end loader to his oldest tractor. When Claire brought out a thermos of coffee at mid-morning, she stopped in her tracks. River wasn't plowing. He was down in the ravine, scooping up massive buckets of the discarded limestone and hauling them back to the western property line. He dumped them in a long, chaotic pile that stretched for 100 yards. "River," she called out over the roar of the diesel engine, "what on earth are you doing? We're already behind on planting." River killed the engine and climbed down, his eyes alight with a feverish intensity she hadn't seen in years. "I'm building a wall, Claire." "A wall?" She looked at the jagged stones. "To keep out what? The deer?" "To keep out the wind," River said, walking over to the pile and lifting a 40-pound slab of limestone. "I spent the whole night doing the math. If I build a dry stone wall, 6 feet high and 3 feet thick at the base, running the entire 2-mile stretch of the western perimeter, it will act as a windbreak. It won't just stop the howler from snapping the stalks, it will alter the aerodynamic flow, lifting the wind up and over the fields." Claire stared at him, aghast. 2 miles? River, that will take thousands of tons of rock. It's back-breaking work. You're one man, and even if you could do it, the town will think you've lost your mind. "Let them think what they want," River said, his jaw setting into a stubborn line. "The bank has already given us a death sentence. Doing the same thing we've always done guarantees we lose the farm. This is the only variable I can change." And so began the grueling, agonizing work. Building a dry stone wall, relying entirely on gravity and friction without a drop of mortar, is an ancient, precise art. River had to sort the stones. Massive, flat foundation stones for the base, smaller, hearting stones to fill the center, and heavy cope stones to lock the top in place. For the first month, River worked like a man possessed. He would be out at the western perimeter by 4 a.m., working by the harsh glare of tractor halogens. He hoisted, rotated, and slammed the rocks into place. His hands bled through heavy leather gloves. His lower back screamed in constant throbbing agony. Every muscle in his 58-year-old body begged him to stop. News travels faster than wind in a farming community. Within weeks, River's project became the main source of entertainment down at Miller's Diner in town. Thomas Cobb, a local gossip and hardware store owner, held court at the counter. "I drove by Pendleton's place yesterday," Cobb chuckled, stirring his coffee. "He's out there stacking rocks like he's building a pyramid for the pharaohs. Left his north field completely fallow just so he has time to play with stones." Richard Abernathy, sitting in a booth nearby, smirked. "It's a tragedy, really. The stress of the debt has finally broken the poor old man's mind. Building a medieval wall against a Category 2 windstorm. I give it until July before he collapses from heat stroke. I'll buy the land at auction for pennies on the dollar." But River didn't collapse. As spring turned to summer, the wall grew. It was a rugged, beautiful structure, an immense grey spine rising against the horizon. River learned the rhythm of the stones. He learned to read the grain of the limestone, instinctively knowing which rock would perfectly lock into the gaps. It wasn't just physical labor, it was engineering. To prevent the wall from acting as a solid sail that the wind could easily push over, River left calculated tiny gaps between the stones. Permeability. It allowed about 20% of the wind to pass through, diffusing the pressure and preventing a vacuum on the leeward side, while violently braking the destructive velocity of the main gusts. By late August, 1.5 miles of the wall was completed. started. The wheat he had managed to plant behind it was growing, but the real test was looming. The air was already beginning to change. The sky took on a pale, bruised color in the late afternoons. The howler was coming, and this year the meteorologists on the local news were predicting it would be the strongest wind shear the valley had seen in a decade. One evening, as River was locking a massive copestone onto the top tier of the wall, he noticed an unfamiliar truck parked on the county road adjacent to his property. Two men were leaning against the hood, watching him through binoculars. They wore jackets with the Abernathy AgriCorp logo. When they saw River looking, they quickly got into the truck and sped off. A cold knot of suspicion formed in River's stomach. Abernathy wasn't just waiting for him to fail anymore. Abernathy was watching. The stakes were getting too high, and the corporate giant was starting to realize that the crazy old man's wall might actually be a threat to his cheap acquisition. The second week of September brought an eerie silence to Oakhaven Valley. The birds stopped singing, and the air grew heavy, thick with static electricity. Every farmer in the Devil's Corridor was scrambling, battening down hatches, moving equipment into reinforced barns, and looking at their vulnerable crops with dread. At 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, the silence broke. It started as a low, guttural moan rolling off the western foothills. Within 20 minutes, it escalated into a deafening, freight train roar. The howler had arrived. Sustained winds hit 60 miles per hour, with gusts pushing 85. Dust, loose topsoil, and debris were weaponized in the air, creating a blinding, scouring storm. Inside the farmhouse, the timbers groaned and shrieked. Claire sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. River stood by the window, staring out into the pitch-black void. He couldn't see the wall, but he could hear the wind tearing across the plains. "River, come away from the glass," Claire pleaded over the roar. "If the wall falls, it'll trigger a domino effect," River muttered, his voice barely audible. 2 miles of stone will collapse onto the fields. It'll crush the crop and make the soil unfarmable. I've bet the entire farm on friction and gravity. The storm raged for 14 hours. It was the longest night of River's life. When the sun finally began to bleed through the dust-choked sky the next afternoon, the wind dropped to a harsh, steady breeze. River didn't wait for the all clear on the radio. He grabbed his coat, pushed open the heavy oak door, and stepped out into the bruised light. The air smelled of pulverized earth. He walked toward the western perimeter, his heart hammering against his ribs. As the dust settled, the silhouette of the horizon came into view. The wall still stood. It wasn't perfectly pristine. Some of the topmost copestones had been vibrated loose and tumbled to the ground, but the structure itself was intact. The massive, interlocking puzzle of limestone had absorbed the kinetic fury of the storm, but the true miracle was on the ground. River walked past the wall and looked at his wheat. The stalks were perfectly upright, swaying gently. Behind the wall, for a distance of almost half a mile, the air was eerily calm. The wall had functioned exactly as his frantic midnight math had predicted. It had caught the wind, fractured its velocity, and forced the sheer force up into the atmosphere, creating a massive, protective bubble over his fields. Then River noticed something else, something he hadn't planned for. He knelt down and touched the soil. The howler was notorious for sucking every ounce of moisture out of the earth, leaving it bone dry and powdery. But the soil here was dark. It was damp. River looked at the wall. The thousands of tons of limestone had trapped the morning dew. Moreover, the massive thermal mass of the rocks, absorbing heat during the day and radiating it at night, had created a microclimate. It had prevented the harsh frost that usually accompanied the autumn winds, keeping the soil temperature stable and locking the moisture into the ground. Less wind stress meant the plants didn't have to fight to survive. Their stomata stayed open, continuing to photosynthesize and grow at peak capacity. A truck came roaring down the dirt access road, slamming on its brakes in a cloud of dust. It was Richard Abernathy. Abernathy stepped out of his truck, his usually immaculate clothes covered in a fine layer of silt. He looked frantic. He marched over to the property line, stopping dead in his tracks when he looked over the wall. "My fields," Abernathy stammered, staring at River's pristine crops. "My western quadrant is gone, flattened. The topsoil blew all the way to the state line." He looked at River, then up at the towering 6-foot-high wall of dry stone. The mockery that had danced in Abernathy's eyes all summer was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, desperate panic. "Pendleton," Abernathy said, his voice dropping to a low, tight frequency. "This is a fluke. You got lucky, but you still owe the bank 450 grand. You haven't harvested yet. A lot can happen before the combines roll out." River stood up slowly, wiping the damp, rich soil from his hands. "Are you threatening my farm, Richard?" Abernathy pulled a checkbook from his breast pocket. "I am making a final business offer. I will write you a check right now for $500,000. It pays off your bank and gives you 50 grand to retire quietly in Florida. But you sign the deed over to AgriCorp today. If you don't..." Abernathy stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "It would be a terrible shame if your wall suddenly experienced a structural failure right before harvest. Accidents happen with unstable, amateur rock piles." River looked at the man, then looked at the 2 miles of stone he had built with his own bleeding hands. He had beaten the rocks. He had beaten the wind. He wasn't about to bow to a corporate bully. "Get off my land, Richard," River said, his voice as hard and unyielding as the limestone behind him. "And if I ever see your trucks idling near my wall again, I won't be calling the sheriff. I'll be coming out here with my shotgun." Abernathy's face flushed with rage. He snapped his checkbook shut, spun on his heel, and stormed back to his truck. As he sped away, spinning his tires in the dirt, River knew the war was far from over. The wind had been stopped, but a new, much more dangerous storm was just beginning to brew. The victory over the howler was intoxicating, but River Pendleton was not a naive man. He knew Richard Abernathy. Abernathy didn't just want the land, he wanted the satisfaction of breaking the man who refused to sell it. The threat delivered at the property line wasn't empty posturing, it was a promise. As October crept in, bringing crisp mornings and golden afternoons, the wheat behind the limestone wall transformed. It was a sight that defied the harsh history of Oakhaven Valley. The stalks were thick, heavy with amber grain, bowing slightly under their own unprecedented weight. The microclimate created by the wall had not only saved the crop from the wind shear, but the retained ground moisture and regulated temperatures had triggered an explosive growth phase. River was looking at a yield that wasn't just healthy, it was double his historical average. It was enough to pay off Henry Higgins at the credit union, fix the equipment, and secure the farm for another 5 years. But the closer they got to harvest, the heavier the dread sat in River's chest. He stopped sleeping. Every night after Claire had gone to bed, River would pour a thermos of black coffee, grab his grandfather's old Remington 870 pump-action shotgun from the gun cabinet, and walk out into the freezing prairie night. He became a ghost, haunting his own perimeter, walking the 2-mile stretch of the wall, listening to the vast, empty silence of the Devil's Corridor. It happened on a moonless Thursday, 4 days before River planned to fire up the combine harvester. At 2 a.m. the wind was a low whisper. River was sitting on a flat outcropping of limestone near the northern edge of the wall, the shotgun resting across his knees. He was fighting heavy eyelids when he felt it before he heard it, a low rhythmic vibration coming through the soles of his boots. He stood up, his senses instantly dialed to maximum. A quarter-mile down the property line, near the access road, a set of headlights flicked on, then immediately died. River didn't use his flashlight. He moved through the tall wheat, using the shadow of the wall for cover. As he closed the distance, the unmistakable, throaty idle of a diesel engine pierced the night. Then came a horrific sound, the grinding, screeching protest of heavy steel scraping against stone. He broke into a run. When he rounded a slight curve in the wall, he saw them. A heavy-duty Bobcat skid-steer loader, painted in industrial yellow, was positioned perfectly perpendicular to the wall. 2 men were operating in the dark. One was in the cab, the other, a burly man named Leon, who River recognized from town, was hooking a heavy tow chain around one of the massive, load-bearing foundation stones at the base of the wall. Abernathy hadn't sent them to push the wall over. He had sent them to pull it apart from the bottom. If they removed the foundation stones, the entire interlocking structure above it would violently collapse, causing a localized landslide of limestone that would bury the mature wheat and leave the field exposed to the impending autumn frosts. The skid steer roared as the driver threw it into reverse. The heavy chain snapped taut. The wall groaned, a deep, agonizing sound of thousands of pounds of carefully balanced friction failing. A fine shower of limestone dust cascaded down from the top tiers. "Hey!" River roared, racking the slide of the Remington. The metallic clack-clack echoed like a cannon shot in the quiet night. Leon scrambled backward, tripping over a loose rock and falling into the dirt. The driver of the skid steer panicked, slamming the brakes. "Cut the engine! And get your hands where I can see them," River yelled, stepping out of the shadows, the barrel of the shotgun leveled directly at the cab of the machine. The driver threw his hands up, instantly killing the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the settling dust and the terrified panting of the two men. 10 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a county cruiser illuminated the dust. Sheriff Mitchell Barnes, a man who had known River since high school, stepped out, shining his heavy maglite over the scene. He looked at the skid steer, the taut chain, the groaning wall, and finally at River, who still had the shotgun at the ready. Barnes sighed, pushing his hat back on his head. "Put the gun down, River. I've got it from here." As Barnes handcuffed Leon and the driver, both of whom immediately claimed they were just lost and trying to clear a path to turn around, River inspected the damage. The foundation stone had been dragged out by 6 inches. The structural integrity of a 30-foot section of the wall was completely compromised. It was leaning precariously, a gentle nudge away from total collapse. "They work for Abernathy," River said to the sheriff, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and adrenaline. "He sent them to destroy the wall, to ruin the harvest." Sheriff Barnes leaned against his cruiser, looking tired. "River, these boys are independent contractors. Unless you have a recording of Richard Abernathy handing them a wad of cash and a blueprint of your wall, I can't touch him. I'll charge them with trespassing and vandalism, but they'll be out on bail by breakfast. Abernathy's lawyers will make sure of it, so he just gets away with it." "He's insulated," Barnes said quietly. "You protect your farm, River. I'll do what I can, but you know how this county works." When the cruiser drove away, towing the impounded skid steer, River was left alone in the dark. He looked at the bulging, compromised section of the wall. If he left it, the entire section would fall by morning. The temperature was dropping fast, a frost was coming, and the breach would funnel the freezing air directly into the heart of his best crop. He had no choice. At 4 a.m., exhausting every reserve of energy in his aging body, River fired up his own tractor. He spent the next 6 hours painstakingly dismantling the damaged section of the wall, rock by rock, and rebuilding it. His hands bled through a fresh pair of gloves. His vision blurred from fatigue. When the sun finally crested the horizon, painting the Oakhaven Valley in brilliant hues of orange and gold, the wall was whole again. River slumped against the cold limestone, utterly spent but victorious. Abernathy's physical sabotage had failed. The harvest would begin tomorrow. The roar of the John Deere combine harvester was the sweetest sound River had ever heard. It was a mechanical symphony of survival. As the massive header chewed through the golden sea of wheat, the grain tank behind the cab filled at a speed River had never witnessed in his 40 years of farming. Claire rode in the buddy seat next to him, in the air-conditioned cab, her hands pressed against the glass, a brilliant, tearful smile on her face. "It's beautiful, River. It's absolutely beautiful." "It's going to be enough," River said, his voice thick with emotion as he checked the yield monitor. "It's going to pay off Higgins, clear the seed debts, and give us a buffer for next year." "The wall did it, Claire." They harvested the inner acres for 2 days without incident. The weather held perfectly. Abernathy was nowhere to be seen, and the local thugs had vanished. River finally allowed himself to believe they had won. On the morning of the 3rd day, they were preparing to harvest the Golden Strip, the half-mile stretch of wheat growing directly behind the limestone wall, where the microclimate had produced the most staggering yield of the entire farm. River was greasing the combine's auger when a pristine white Ford Explorer with the Oakhaven County seal on the door slowly pulled up the driveway. A man in a sharp gray suit and a meticulously groomed mustache stepped out, carrying a thick leather briefcase. It was Walter Pratt, the county zoning and land management commissioner. Pratt was widely known in the valley as a man whose pockets were lined with corporate agricultural money. River wiped his hands on a rag, a familiar knot of dread tightening in his stomach. "Morning, River," Pratt said, his tone overly cordial, entirely out of place on a working farm. "Looks like you're having a banner year." "What can I do for you, Walter?" River asked flatly. "I've got 300 acres left to cut, and the weather isn't going to hold forever. Pratt opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers, bound by a heavy black clip. He handed them to River. The top page was stamped with the word injunction in bold red ink. I'm afraid the harvest on your western perimeter has to halt immediately, River, Pratt said, adjusting his tie. The county office received a formal environmental and zoning grievance yesterday. River stared at the paper. A grievance? From who? Abernathy Agri-Corp, Pratt replied smoothly. Mr. Abernathy's engineers have filed a report claiming that your unpermitted 2-mile stone structure has fundamentally altered the natural watershed and drainage patterns of the Devil's Corridor. They are claiming that your wall creates an artificial dam which poses a severe flooding risk to his lower elevation fields during the spring thaw. That's a blatant lie, River shouted, taking a step toward the commissioner. It's a dry stone wall. It's permeable. Water flows right through the gaps. It doesn't hold back water. It holds back the wind. That may be your opinion, River, but it's an unpermitted structure of significant scale, Pratt said, stepping back slightly but maintaining his smug composure. Because it borders commercial agricultural land, the county is legally obligated to investigate the claim. Until a county-appointed surveyor can conduct a full environmental impact study, there is a stop work order on the structure and a 200-yard buffer zone. You cannot operate heavy machinery or harvest within that zone. River felt the blood drain from his face. 200 yards from the wall. That buffer zone encompassed the entirety of the Golden Strip. It contained nearly 40% of his total yield. Without that grain, he would fall $20,000 short of the bank's foreclosure threshold. Walter, the bank deadline is November 1st, River said, his voice dropping to a desperate rasp. If I don't harvest that strip this week, the frost will kill it, or the birds will take it. You are signing the death warrant for my farm based on a bogus piece of paper. My hands are tied, River, Pratt said, tapping his briefcase. The surveyor is booked up. He might be able to get out here by mid-November. If you violate the injunction and harvest the buffer zone, the county will seize the grain and fine you double its value. Have a good day, River. Pratt got back into his white SUV and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled over the silent combine harvester. River walked into the house and laid the injunction on the kitchen table. Claire looked at the document, then looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. They had fought the rocks. They had fought the wind. They had fought the vandals in the night. But how do you fight the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen? Abernathy had found the perfect weapon. He didn't need to destroy the wall. He just needed to make it legally untouchable until the clock ran out. River sat in silence for a long time, staring at the red ink on the paper. He thought about his father and his grandfather before him, pulling those rocks out of the earth. He thought about the blood he had left on the limestone. River? Claire whispered. What do we do? River slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. The look of defeat in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating fire. Walter Pratt said the injunction is based on county zoning boundaries and commercial agricultural borders, River muttered, walking toward the old wooden filing cabinet in the corner of the living room. Yes? Claire asked, confused. This farm was homesteaded in 1892, River said, violently pulling open the heavy metal drawer. The county didn't incorporate this valley until 1915. Richard Abernathy thinks he knows where the property lines are because he uses a GPS satellite. But GPS only maps what the county tells it to map. River began pulling out stacks of brittle yellowed folders, tossing them onto the rug. What are you looking for? Claire asked, dropping to her knees to help him sort through the century-old paperwork. My grandfather's original land patent, River said, a grim smile touching the corner of his mouth. Abernathy wants to play a game of legal technicalities. He's about to find out that the Pendletons built a lot more than just a wall on this land. The farmhouse living room looked like a museum that had been ransacked. For 8 hours straight, River and Claire sat cross-legged on the faded Persian rug, surrounded by over a century of Pendleton family history. There were birth certificates, old ledger books detailing seed prices from the Great Depression, and sepia-toned photographs of men with hard faces standing next to steam-powered tractors. But River was hunting for something specific. The The county incorporated in 1915, River muttered, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. Zoning laws didn't even exist here until the late 30s. Abernathy is using modern commercial boundaries to claim my wall is a dam. We need the original survey. At 2:15 a.m., Claire let out a sharp gasp. She was holding a large, incredibly brittle piece of heavy parchment, folded into tight squares. The ink was faded to a deep rust color. "River," she whispered, carefully unfolding the document on the coffee table. "Look at the seal." It was a United States land patent, dated October 14th, 1892. At the bottom, signed in sweeping, authoritative cursive, was the signature of President Benjamin Harrison. River leaned in, holding a magnifying glass over the dense, archaic legal text. His grandfather, Elias Pendleton, hadn't just bought the land. He had claimed it under a specific Agrarian Expansion Act, meant to settle the hostile Western Plains. River's finger traced the lines until he stopped cold. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his weathered face. "Read this section," River said, his voice trembling with exhausted adrenaline. "Right here, under the topographical addendums." Claire leaned closer and read aloud. "The claimant, Elias Pendleton, is hereby granted sovereign right to the subterranean limestone deposits spanning the western perimeter. Furthermore, under the Agrarian Defense Clause, the claimant retains the permanent right to extract and assemble said native stone for the sole purpose of windbreak and harvest fortification, exempt from any future territorial or municipal waterway restrictions." River stood up, the exhaustion suddenly vanishing from his bones. "My grandfather didn't just dump those rocks in the ravine because he was tired. He registered them. He legally claimed the right to build a wall 50 years before the county even drew a map. It's a federal patent, Claire. It supersedes Walter Pratt and his corrupt zoning board." At 8 a.m. sharp, River's muddy F-150 pulled into the pristine parking lot of the Oakhaven County Courthouse. He marched up the marble steps, carrying the fragile 1892 patent inside a hard plastic sleeve. Walter Pratt was sitting in his plush office, sipping a latte, when his door swung open. "River," Pratt sighed, looking annoyed. "I told you, the surveyor won't be available for weeks. You cannot bully your way past an injunction." "I don't need a surveyor, Walter. I need Judge Caldwell, right now." 20 minutes later, in the quiet, wood-paneled chambers of County Judge Harrison Caldwell, an emergency injunction review was underway. Richard Abernathy, who had been hastily summoned, sat next to his slick corporate attorney, Sterling Carmichael. Abernathy looked supremely confident, leaning back in his leather chair. "Your Honor," Carmichael began, adjusting his designer glasses, "this is a waste of the court's time. Mr. Pendleton has constructed an unpermitted 2-mile dam that threatens to flood my client's commercial acreage during the spring melt. The stop work order must remain." Judge Caldwell, a stern man in his late 60s who had grown up on a dairy farm, peered over his reading glasses at River. "Mr. Pendleton, you are operating heavy machinery in a restricted buffer zone. The environmental impact—" "There is no environmental impact, Your Honor, because the county has no jurisdiction over that perimeter," River interrupted smoothly. He slid the plastic sleeve across the heavy mahogany desk. Caldwell frowned, pulling the document out. The room went silent for 2 full minutes as the judge read the parchment. Abernathy's smug expression began to falter. He leaned over, whispering furiously to his lawyer. Judge Caldwell finally looked up, letting out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. A signed patent from Benjamin Harrison. I haven't seen one of these in 30 years. "What is that?" Carmichael demanded, standing up. "Your Honor, a historical artifact doesn't negate modern environmental zoning." "Actually, Mr. Carmichael, it does," Caldwell shot back, his tone sharp. "Under federal land law, specifically the homestead provisions of 1892, this document grants the Pendleton estate the sovereign, grandfathered right to utilize native limestone for wind fortification. It explicitly exempts the structure from municipal waterway restrictions." Abernathy jumped to his feet, his face turning an ugly shade of crimson. "That's a technicality. He's building a hazard. He is exercising a federal property right that predates this courthouse, Mr. Abernathy," Judge Caldwell stated, slamming his palm on the desk. "The county zoning grievance is invalid. The injunction is dissolved, effective immediately. Mr. Pendleton, you may harvest your grain." River didn't gloat. He simply nodded, picked up his grandfather's patent, and walked out of the chambers. He had exactly 3 days until the bank's deadline. The harvest of the golden strip was nothing short of legendary. When River returned to the farm, he and Claire worked around the clock. The combine's headlights cut through the autumn nights, devouring the towering, heavy stalks of wheat that the limestone wall had protected. The yield monitor in the cab blinked with numbers that River had never seen in his lifetime. The microclimate hadn't just saved the crop, it had optimized it. They were pulling in 90 bushels an acre. By the evening of October 30th, just 48 hours before the bank's foreclosure deadline, 3 massive semi-trailers sat idling in River's driveway. They were filled to the brim with premium, golden, hard red winter wheat. Over 80,000 pounds of grain. It was enough to pay the arrears, settle the equipment loans, and put Pendleton acres safely in the black. "We did it," Claire whispered, leaning against River's shoulder as they watched the diesel exhaust curl into the cold night air. "Almost," River said, kissing the top of her head. "I just have to haul it into town, get the way tickets, and hand the check to Higgins at the credit union. I'll be back before lunch tomorrow." The next morning, River drove the lead semi-truck, followed by 2 hired drivers, down the county highway toward the Oak Haven Co-op grain elevator. The elevator was a towering concrete fortress that dominated the town's skyline, the central nervous system of the valley's agricultural economy. As River's convoy pulled onto the massive weighing scales, he grabbed his paperwork and climbed down from the cab. The crisp morning air smelled of grain dust and diesel. He walked into the scale house, expecting to see the usual morning crew joking around the coffee pot. Instead, the room was tense, quiet, and occupied by a single man behind the bulletproof glass. Dale Robertson, the elevator manager. Dale looked pale, refusing to make eye contact as River slid his harvest manifest through the slot. "Morning, Dale. I've got 3 loads of hard red. The moisture content is perfect," River said, tapping the glass. Dale stared at the manifest, his hands trembling slightly. He pushed the paper back through the slot. I can't take it, River." River frowned. "What do you mean you can't take it? The silos aren't full. I saw the capacity report online this morning." "It's not the capacity," Dale stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold room. "It's a new quality control mandate. The board of directors instituted it yesterday afternoon. We are temporarily barring any grain harvested within 5 miles of unregulated, non-agricultural mineral structures." River stared at him, the words ringing in his ears. "Mineral structures." "My wall," River said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Dale nodded miserably. "They claim the limestone dust from your construction could be contaminating the wheat. It's a biohazard liability. They won't let me dump your trucks, River. I'll lose my pension." "Since when does the board care about limestone dust?" River demanded, his fists clenching. "Half this valley is paved with limestone. Since Richard Abernathy bought a 51% controlling stake in the co-op last week," a voice said from the doorway. River turned. Richard Abernathy was leaning against the doorframe, wearing a tailored overcoat, looking like a king surveying his conquered territory. "Abernathy," River growled, taking a step toward him. River. "No violence. We're businessmen here," Abernathy smiled, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just protecting my investment. As the majority shareholder of this elevator, I can't risk contaminating the valley's food supply with your dirty rock dust wheat." It was a master stroke of corporate cruelty. Abernathy hadn't been able to tear the wall down, and he hadn't been able to stop the harvest legally, so he simply bought the only door out of the valley. "You know there's no dust in that grain," River said, his voice shaking with a rage so profound it made his vision blur. "You know it's the best wheat this county has seen in a decade." "Doesn't matter what I know," Abernathy smirked. "What matters is that you have 80,000 pounds of grain sitting in those trucks, and nowhere to dump it. The nearest independent elevator is in the next state, 100 miles away. You don't have the commercial interstate transport licenses to take it there. And even if you did, you wouldn't make it back before the bank closes tomorrow at 5 p.m. Abernathy pulled a sleek silver pen from his pocket and held it out. "The offer is back on the table, River. But since you've been so difficult, the price has dropped. I'll buy Pendleton acres for exactly what you owe the bank. You walk away with nothing, but you avoid bankruptcy. Sign the deed. River looked at the pen. He looked at the massive concrete silos of the elevator, built by the sweat of his grandfather's generation, now owned by a man who had never touched a plow in his life. The physical exhaustion of building the wall, the sleepless nights, fighting the injunction, the terrifying reality of the deadline, it all crashed down on River in a suffocating wave. Abernathy had built a wall of his own, made of money and red tape, and it was entirely impenetrable. River turned his back on Abernathy, walking out of the scale house and back toward his idling semi-truck. "You have until tomorrow at 4:59 p.m., Pendleton," Abernathy called out after him, laughing. "After that, the bank takes it anyway." River climbed into the cab of his truck and slammed the door. He picked up the CB radio microphone. "Boys," he said to the hired drivers, his voice hollow, "turn the rigs around. We're heading back to the farm." As the three massive trucks lumbered off the scales and headed back down the highway, River felt a cold, crushing defeat settle over him. He had stopped the wind, but he couldn't stop the system. He was going to lose his grandfather's farm. Unbeknownst to River, however, the confrontation in the scale house had not gone unnoticed. Thomas Cobb, the local hardware store owner and town gossip, had been sitting in his pickup truck near the loading bays, waiting to pick up a shipment of feed. His window had been rolled down. He had heard every word. And in Oakhaven Valley, there was one thing farmers hated more than rocks and the wind: a corporate suit starving out one of their own. The drive back to Pendleton Acres was a funeral procession. The three massive semi-trucks, heavy with 80,000 pounds of premium wheat, groaned in low gear down the dirt access road. When River finally cut the engine of the lead rig, the silence that followed was suffocating. Claire came out to the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She took one look at the three full trailers and River's hollow, ashen face, and she knew. She didn't ask questions. She just walked down the steps and wrapped her arms around her husband's neck as he stood frozen in the driveway. "He bought the elevator," River whispered, his voice cracking. "Instituted a bogus contamination policy against the limestone wall. We have the grain, Claire, but we have no way to turn it into cash by tomorrow afternoon. It's over." They sat at the kitchen table as the sun dipped below the horizon, watching the clock tick. Every minute that passed was a minute closer to 5 p.m. the next day, when Henry Higgins at the credit union would legally hand the deed of Pendleton Acres over to Richard Abernathy. At 8:30 p.m., the silence of the farm was broken by the crunch of gravel. River looked out the window. It wasn't one set of headlights. It was a line of them, snaking all the way down the county road. He grabbed his coat and stepped out onto the porch. A fleet of pickup trucks, flatbeds towing gravity wagons, and older, beat-up grain haulers were pulling into his yard. Doors slammed, and heavy work boots hit the dirt. At the front of the pack was Thomas Cobb, the hardware store owner. Behind him was a sea of familiar faces: the Miller brothers, Old Man Henderson, Dave Gable, and a dozen other independent farmers from the valley, men who had laughed at River's wall all summer. "Thomas?" River asked, bewildered. "What is all this?" Cobb walked up to the porch, pulling off his worn baseball cap. "I was at the co-op this morning, River. I had my window down. Heard the whole damn thing between you and Abernathy." Cobb turned to the crowd of farmers behind him. "I made a few calls. Turns out nobody in this valley is too keen on Abernathy buying the elevator and deciding who gets to survive and who starves. If he can do it to you over a pile of rocks, he can do it to any of us over anything." "I appreciate the sentiment, Thomas. I really do," River said, rubbing his eyes. "But unless one of you brought $500,000 in cash, there's nothing to be done. I can't legally haul this out of state to an independent buyer. I don't have the commercial interstate transport licenses. Even if I drove through the night, the DOT scales would impound my trucks the second I crossed the state line." "You don't have the licenses," a deep voice boomed from the back. It was Dave Gable, a man who farmed 600 acres to the south. "But you're forgetting the FMCSA agricultural exemption, River." River blinked. "The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration? Section 390.39? Cobb grinned, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his flannel pocket. "Any agricultural commodity transported by the farmers themselves using farm-plated vehicles within a 150 air-mile radius is completely exempt from interstate commercial licensing. The Independent High Plains elevator in Nebraska is exactly 112 miles from this porch." River looked at the massive semi-trailers, then at the fleet of smaller trucks in his yard. "I have 80,000 pounds of wheat. It would take a commercial fleet to move it." "No," Cobb said, his eyes gleaming in the porch light. "It takes a community. "We brought our augers, River," Old Man Henderson chimed in. "If we divide your £80,000 among 15 of our farm trucks, we're all legally under the weight limit, and we're legally exempt to cross the state line." Abernathy choked the co-op, but he doesn't own the highway. River stared at the men. His chest tightened, a fierce, burning wave of emotion welling up in his throat. These men were risking their own time, their own fuel, and Abernathy's future wrath, just to save a farm that wasn't theirs. "Well," Cobb asked, gesturing to the idling trucks, "are we going to stand here freezing? Or are we going to steal your farm back from that corporate parasite?" "Start the augers," River choked out, a fierce smile finally breaking across his face. For the next 6 hours, Pendleton Acres looked like a military staging ground. The roar of portable grain augers filled the night air as 80,000 pounds of premium, wall-protected wheat was systematically transferred from River's 3 grounded semi-trailers into the 15 smaller farm-plated trucks of the Oakhaven Rebellion. Limestone dust and grain chaff sparkled under the harsh glare of halogen work lights. By 3 a.m., the last truck was topped off and securely tarped. "We roll at first light," Cobb told the exhausted men, passing around thermoses of Claire's black coffee. "We stay in a convoy. We don't speed. We don't give the state troopers any reason to pull us over. We drop the grain, get the certified checks, and get River back to the bank." The sun broke over the jagged silhouette of the limestone wall, casting a long, defiant shadow across the freshly harvested fields of Pendleton Acres. At exactly 6 a.m., the convoy rolled out. 15 farm trucks, a ragtag fleet of dented Fords, rusted Chevys, and aging flatbeds pulled onto the county highway in a tight, disciplined line. Their suspensions groaned under the distributed weight of 80,000 pounds of premium golden wheat. River rode shotgun in Thomas Cobb's heavily modified diesel pickup at the head of the pack. The heater in the cab roared, fighting off the bitter autumn chill, but the tension in the vehicle was entirely separate from the temperature. They had exactly 11 hours until the Midwest Agrarian Credit Union locked its heavy glass doors at 5 o'clock. Back in Oakhaven Valley, Richard Abernathy was sitting behind the massive mahogany desk in his corner office, sipping a freshly brewed espresso. He was admiring the pristine view of his corporate fields when his desk phone chimed. It was Dale Robertson, the manager at the co-op elevator. "Mr. Abernathy," Dale stammered, his voice thin and panicked over the line. "One of my spotters out on Highway 84 just called in. There's a 15-truck convoy crossing the county line, heading north toward the Nebraska border. It's all the local boys, Dave Gable, the Miller brothers, Old Man Henderson, and sir, they're hauling Pendleton's wheat." Abernathy's hand jerked, spilling hot espresso across his immaculate silk tie. "What are you talking about? That's impossible. They can't cross state lines with that much commercial freight. They don't have the interstate transport licenses. The highway patrol will impound every single truck before they make it 50 miles. They aren't running as commercial freight, sir," Dale replied miserably. "They divided the load. They're running under the 150-mile federal agricultural exemption. It's totally legal. Get me Sheriff Barnes," Abernathy roared, slamming his fist onto the desk. "Now!" 10 minutes later, Abernathy was pacing his office, screaming into his cell phone. "Barnes, I want that convoy pulled over immediately. They are transporting contaminated, hazardous material out of this county. You have jurisdiction, and I demand you use it." Sheriff Barnes, sitting comfortably in his cruiser outside Miller's diner with a fresh cup of coffee, let out a long, satisfied sigh into the receiver. "Richard, I've told you before, I don't work for your corporation. I enforce the law. Those boys are running farm plates, carrying their own organic commodities, and staying under the weight limits. They are perfectly legal under federal FMCSA regulations. And as for your sudden, deep concern about limestone contamination, Judge Caldwell already ruled that Wall was a legally grandfathered structure. You want them stopped, call the state troopers, but you better have rock-solid proof of a felony, or they'll arrest you for filing a false police report." Barnes hung up the phone, leaving Abernathy screaming into the dead air. For the first time in a decade, the corporate giant realized he had severely miscalculated the resolve of the men he considered to be dirt-poor peasants. The drive north was agonizingly slow. Farm-plated trucks weren't built for speed, and maintaining the convoy meant moving at the pace of the slowest vehicle. Old Man Henderson's sputtering 1980 grain hauler. River watched the digital clock on Cobb's dashboard with a sickening, heavy dread. Every traffic light, every slow-moving tractor on the shoulder, every steep grade felt like a personal attack by the universe. At 11:45 a.m., they finally crossed the state line into Nebraska. By 1:15 p.m., the towering white concrete silos of the Independent High Plains elevator came into view. Because River had called ahead on the CB radio with the convoy's manifest, the elevator manager, a no-nonsense man named Gregson, had 3 unloading bays cleared, swept, and waiting. As the first trucks rolled onto the scales, Gregson climbed up with a long metal probe to pull a core sample of the wheat for moisture and protein testing. 10 minutes later, Gregson walked into the scale house, holding the printout from the testing machine. He looked up at River, completely astounded. "Pendleton, I haven't seen hard red winter wheat this perfect in my entire career," Gregson said, tapping the paper. "The test weight is incredibly dense. The moisture is perfectly locked at 12%. And the protein count is off the charts. That limestone microclimate of yours didn't just protect the crop from the wind shear, it basically incubated it. I'm giving you 25 cents over the top market premium. Dump the trucks." The unloading took nearly 2 hours. By 3:20 p.m., the massive augers finally spun down, and River was standing at the counter, holding a certified cashier's check made out to the Midwest Agrarian Credit Union. The amount was $52,400. It was more than enough to clear his arrears, settle his equipment loans, and put Pendleton Acres safely in the black for the winter. "Go," Cobb said, stepping up behind River and tossing him a ring of keys. "Take my truck. It's a tuned diesel. It's the fastest thing on the lot. We'll follow behind at our own pace. You've got an hour and 40 minutes to get back to Oak Haven before Higgins locks the vault." River didn't hesitate. He sprinted to Cobb's truck, fired up the roaring engine, and threw it into gear. He drove like a man possessed by the ghosts of his ancestors. The engine screamed as he pushed the heavy truck to its absolute limit down the desolate 2-lane prairie highways. The landscape blurred into a streak of brown and gold. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He thought about his grandfather hauling those rocks out of the dirt a century ago. He thought about his own bleeding hands, stacking them. He wasn't going to lose it all to a ticking clock. 4:15 p.m., 4:38 p.m., 4:52 p.m. At exactly 4:56 p.m., River's borrowed truck screeched into the parking lot of the Midwest Agrarian Credit Union, the heavy tires kicking up a massive, blinding cloud of dust. He slammed the transmission into park, didn't even bother cutting the engine, and sprinted for the double glass doors just as the security guard was reaching for the deadbolt. Inside the bank, the overhead fluorescent lights were already being dimmed. Henry Higgins, the bank manager, sat in his plush office with a neat stack of foreclosure documents resting on his blotter. Across the desk sat Richard Abernathy, an expensive silver fountain pen in his hand, a smug, venomous smile plastered across his face. "It's a tragic shame, really, it is," Abernathy was saying smoothly, adjusting his cuffs. "But a man has to know when he's beaten by the natural order of business. River fought a good fight, but the land belongs to those who can afford to tame it. You can just sign the transfer deed right there on the bottom line, Henry, and I'll wire the funds to cover his debt." Higgins let out a heavy, regretful sigh, adjusting his glasses, and reached for the paperwork. The heavy oak door of the office banged open so violently that the brass handle cracked against the drywall, echoing through the quiet bank like a gunshot. River Pendleton stood in the doorway. His chest was heaving violently. He was covered in a fine layer of white limestone dust, diesel soot, and the sweat of a man who had not slept properly in 6 months. He looked like an apparition summoned directly from the unforgiving earth of the Devil's Corridor. Abernathy's smile vanished instantly. The arrogant color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. "No," Abernathy whispered, staring at the dust-covered farmer. "You couldn't have." River walked slowly, deliberately to the mahogany desk. He didn't say a single word to Abernathy. He reached into his heavy canvas coat pocket, pulled out the certified cashier's check from the High Plains elevator, and slammed it down directly on top of the foreclosure documents with a resounding, authoritative smack. $52,400, Henry. River said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that demanded total silence in the room. The arrears are paid in full, the equipment lines are clear, and Pendleton Acres remains mine. Higgins looked down at the check, tracing the watermark with his thumb, before looking up at River. A wide, genuine smile broke across the banker's face. He picked up Abernathy's pristine foreclosure deed, ripped it neatly in half right down the center, and tossed the pieces into the brass wastebasket. The account is settled in full, Mr. Pendleton. Congratulations on a spectacularly successful harvest. Abernathy jumped to his feet, his chair tipping backward and crashing loudly to the floor. This isn't over, Pendleton. I own the co-op elevator. I own the local supply lines. I will hike the fertilizer prices. I will choke your fuel deliveries, and I will bleed you out in the dirt next year. River turned slowly to face the corporate giant. The exhaustion in River's eyes was entirely gone, replaced by an unshakable granite resolve. You don't own the valley, Richard. You just found out what happens when you push desperate men into a corner. We push back. Next year, I'm extending my wall another full mile. I highly suggest you stay on your side of it. River turned his back on Abernathy and walked out of the bank, the heavy glass doors closing softly behind him. The sun was just beginning to set over Oakhaven Valley, painting the vast open sky in violent, beautiful streaks of crimson, burnt orange, and deep purple. As River drove back to his farm, the silhouette of the massive limestone wall rose against the horizon, a jagged, beautiful spine cutting through the wind. It was no longer just an act of desperate engineering. It was a monument to human endurance. By the following spring, something incredible shifted in the culture of the Devil's Corridor. The clatter of heavy machinery echoed across the plains, but the local farmers weren't dumping rocks into the ravines anymore. Up and down the valley, men like Thomas Cobb and Dave Gable were hauling the limestone from their fields and stacking it. They were building their own walls, changing the very landscape of the county. Meanwhile, Abernathy AgriCorp, facing a massive, highly publicized investigation by the state attorney general for monopolistic practices and illegal grain embargoes, was forced to liquidate its controlling shares in the local elevator. River Pendleton stood on his back porch with Claire, his arm wrapped tightly around her waist, listening to the wind whip across the plains. The howler howled, but the golden wheat behind the limestone stood perfectly tall, protected by the very stones the earth had tried to curse them with. He had built a wall to save his farm, but in the end, that wall had built a legacy that no amount of money or wind could ever tear down. What a breathtaking conclusion to River's story. It just goes to show that true strength isn't just about the walls we build to protect ourselves, but the community that stands behind us when the storms roll in. Abernathy thought he could use money to choke the life out of Pendleton Acres, but he completely underestimated the unbreakable bond of farmers who refused to let one of their own fall. If this story of resilience, defiance, and community triumph gave you goosebumps, you know what to do. Hit that like button and share this incredible real-life farming drama with your friends. It helps push these stories out to more people who need to hear them. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive narrative. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in River's boots at the grain elevator? See you in the next one.